Welcome to the MexPat interview. I'm Kathleen Bonet, and today I'm talking to journalist Sam Quinones, author of Dreamland and The Least of Us, both award-winning books about the opioid addiction crisis in the United States, as well as other books. Sam also lived and worked as a journalist in Mexico for 10 years. And today we'll talk about how synthetic opioids have transformed drug trafficking and addiction and what is coming next in this battle. Thank you for joining me today, Sam.
Well, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for asking me, Kathleen.
So, in your book, Dreamland, which came out in 2015 and documented this convergence of the painkiller addiction in the US and the trafficking of cheap heroin from Mexico, I noticed there isn't even an index entry for fentanyl, and I think it speaks to how quickly this has evolved. So, fast forward to January 2026, and we have illicit fentanyl designated a weapon of mass destruction last month
Yeah.
by Trump. And, the administration has been kind of following a war on terror playbook in pursuing drug traffickers. So, as someone who's been following this so closely for over a decade, what surprises you about where we are today?
I would say how much has changed recently in terms of governmental interaction. The tariffs from last year, I think the tariffs from last year actually spurred the Mexican government to get somewhat serious about the production of fentanyl, which they had denied throughout the Lopez Obrador administration. I thought that was foolish and clearly erroneous. So I was good to see that the Mexican government was taking, responsibility for that and beginning to do something. I think during the AMLO administration, there was pretty much nothing being done, as I could tell, about this extraordinarily potent and deadly and deadly drug. I still don't think the United States has done much at all, really, to address the real problem on our side, which is the flow of assault weapons, easily purchased by anybody over 18, apparently. And then many of those are smuggled south to Mexico, arming those very people who are making ungodly amounts of fentanyl and methamphetamine. By the way, fentanyl and methamphetamine cannot be separated. They are not separated on the streets of the United States anymore. They're causing enormous mental illness and overdose death, and have been for several years. So I'd say it's the stuff that's never been tried is all of a sudden being tried, and sometimes it's quite alarming to watch. Sometimes you think, okay, maybe this can work, or maybe this ought to have been tried a while back. But that's kind of what hits me, seeing it very much from abroad.
And so, how has your experience living and working for 10 years in Mexico informed your reporting on this story?
Oh, wow. I mean, well, see, if I was a freelance writer for 10 years down in Mexico, I wrote my two books, which are True Tale from Another Mexico, and then Antonio's Gun and Delfino's Dream. I wrote those two. Never did I really write about Mexican drug trafficking. And the reason for that was twofold. One, I felt far more interesting and far more important story at the time was immigration. Huge quantities of Mexicans going north and settling, not just itinerant workers, but settling in various parts of the United Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, many parts of Georgia, and and I thought it was the immigration story that's much more interesting. But also, I was a freelancer down there, and that meant I had nobody backing me up, no law firm, no major media corporation. I was one of the few that I knew of, one of the few freelancers, American freelancers in Mexico. Nobody in Mexico knew what a freelancer was. There's a job that doesn't really exist in Mexico. I was fairly successful at it, but that doesn't mean I made a lot of money at it.
Right.
I just was able to live well because I made dollars and spent pesos, which is not a bad way of living down in Mexico. I want to say it was a marvelous time. It was a time I felt very, very lucky to be part of. There were so many great, great American journalists down there, good English ones too. But it was a great time. A lot of us were like mid-career, very excited about the possibility, fascinated by the changes going through Mexico. At this time, this would have been 94 to '04. Those were the 10 years when I lived in Mexico. For me too, Mexico just opened up a cornucopia of beautiful, magnificent stories that I was kind of at a point in my career that I was capable of writing longer narrative type stories. That's really what filled these two books that I wrote. But all around me were these magnificent reporters from Los Angeles, and all the major news outlets had them. Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Houston Chronicle. Dudley Althouse from the Houston Chronicle was kind of like the prince, or what, I don't know, the cacique of all the foreign reporters, and he organized a Friday night get together at Bar Nuevo Leon in the Condesa every Fridays, and when I was in town, I would try to make that. It was wonderful. It was very cool, and it was just a very effervescent time. Mexico was changing. A lot of reporters were down there who wanted to be part of that, wanted to follow that story, write about that story. And I was certainly one of them. I went down with very little knowledge of Mexico, and I ended up writing two books about the country. One of the things, though, that I later changed my mind significantly about was about the drug issue. Because, as I say, when I was in Mexico, I didn't really write about it. I had one terrifying, terrifying experience that I wrote about in this book, with my encounter with the narco Mennonites of Chihuahua, south of Juarez, not far from Chihuahua City. And so that was a terrifying thing. The Mennonites up there are very deeply involved, many of them, not all of them. There are many who are not, but so many Mennonites are deeply involved in the in drug trafficking. For at the time was the Juarez drug cartel. I think it's probably some version of the Sinaloa cartel now. But whatever the case, it was a terrifying thing. But I didn't really get into writing about the drug world, um, for the reasons I mentioned. And so when people would ask me if they ever had, and people didn't often do this, why is there a drug problem in Mexico? Is it a drug trafficking problem in Mexico? And in the United States, largely my response would be what the Mexican government's response was, which is that the Americans have this very high demand for drugs. I would say I changed that perspective once I really got into researching it in the United States. That came later, but it was 10 years of immense personal and journalistic growth amid a bunch of really fine reporters, and I count myself extraordinarily lucky to have been part of this amazing scene. News outlets were investing in Mexico coverage because of NAFTA, and then because of the victory of Vicente Fox, which remains one of the greatest moments of my career, to watch Vicente Fox win without any gunshots being fired and be recognized by Nelson Cedillo, who needs to go down in history as one of the great Mexican Democrats. I was just overwhelmed with how beautiful and how wonderful and exciting and challenging my reporting in Mexico, the reporting life in Mexico was. And so it was fantastic, fantastic time. But I satisfied one of the great dreams I had when I began a reporter, as my journalism career as a reporter at daily newspapers. I'd worked for three by the time I moved to Mexico, and my great dream was to be a foreign correspondent. But I did not. I saw that being foreign correspondent, you had to wait your time until somebody anointed you as the next person, and then you only had 3 years. I felt very sorry, I have to say, for the reporters. I would see many of these folks come down for 3-year terms and then leave.
Mhm.
To me, it took me 3 years to understand the country a
Right.
little. And then once you understand the country a little, you realize their stories are everywhere. They're so exciting. They're so mind blowing. And I have to say, as a freelancer, I could not compete with all the correspondents from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and all this politicians that would call them. They would never return a phone call from a little old freelancer like me. And so my job then, I realized, if I wanted to make a living, I had to go outside to provincia. I spent a ton of time in Michoacan. I think I
Okay.
went to Michoacan 30 times, Guanajuato, fair amount as well, Zacatecas as well, Oaxaca, Sinaloa, different places. I went all over, and I went to I think 25 of the 31 states in Mexico when I was there, and and that was great. But it was because I couldn't make a living competing in the halls of power with my colleagues. They had much greater budget, but they, more than anything, the other the
Seth.
politicians and the main actors would always call them back. They
Hmm.
they would never call me back. That didn't happen very much. So it was a beautiful time. And then 10 years is a long time. It was time to go back.
Yeah. Coming back actually to something you already mentioned, which is how your thinking has changed about the supply and demand, basically, in illicit drugs. I've heard you say that these synthetic opioids actually create demand.
Yes, and I would say that opioids create demand. We saw that first with the opioid epidemic, which was a massive expansion
Hmm.
of prescribing of legitimate medical opioids like Vicodin, Percocet. Of course, OxyContin was kind of like the hallmark of the whole thing, the vanguard of it all. But and the reason I say that is because unlike cocaine, unlike other drugs, marijuana, what have you, although very much like methamphetamine, I have to say, the opioids change your brain chemistry to be almost physically dependent on these. And so that was the idea that supply will create demand was basically the business model of the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma. They thought if we get these doctors to prescribe even small amounts of OxyContin, which contains oxycodone, which is an opioid, a kind of semi-synthetic opioid that was invented around World War I, but is now they transformed it to be kind of time release. So you have a lot of the opioid in the pill because it's got to go over 8 or 12 hours. 12 hours is what they advertise. Turned out not to be true, but 8 hours. But as long as you get doctors to prescribe a little bit,
Hmm.
and you keep on visiting, getting their face all the time, 2, 3 visits a month instead of once every 2 months, or as pharmaceutical salesmen used to do, they will continue to prescribe it, and the people will eventually demand it. And that is exactly what happened. And that is because the opioids transform the brain chemistry to such a degree that there's a physical dependence that is not a psychological dependence like cocaine.
Hmm.
And so we saw this idea first, and it was my book Dreamland that really got me thinking about this, which was that you create demand that was not there
Hmm.
by massive flows of an opioid. And in this case, it was the legal, legitimate prescription, medicinal, kind of medically sanctioned opioids made by pharmaceutical companies who were a big part of the mix too. They were the ones, Purdue Pharma, and then also pharmaceutical chains and so on, pushing this stuff, this idea that we needed to really aggressively use this tool that we had been very, very reluctant to
Hmm.
use. Because why? Well, we thought that they were addictive. Well, it turns out science knows now that these pills are not addictive for people who are in pain and are coming to doctors for pain help. Science knew nothing of the kind. And so it was this combination of economic power
Hmm.
pushing a drug or a class of drugs that were mightily, mightily addictive. And you saw a very clear case of of supply. The supplies of prescriptions of opioids in the United States in 1996 took off like a plane leaving the tarmac and just kept rising for years and years. And so did deaths.
Hmm.
Same way. So did requests for treatment, ER visits for opioid, all that stuff all begins to move north once this big push to prescribe these pills happens. And the same is absolutely true in terms of just the enormous enormity of the supply
Hmm.
with fentanyl and methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is the one drug that you could make an argument does, particularly in the potency in which the Mexicans are now making it. Methamphetamine is the one drug that really also seems to do some kind of change to the brain and make it very, very difficult to get away from,
Hmm.
particularly when it comes in the potency. The purity is just, in my newsletter, I wrote a piece about the purity of methamphetamine, which I wrote a lot about in The Least of Us,
Hmm.
and which has been part of what I've been writing about since then. Um, and the purity is nothing. It's like, back in the early 2000s, the meth that we got from Mexico was like 40%, 50%, 60% methamphetamine, 40% filler. Now it's 95% methamphetamine. And so all of this changed my mind about it.
Mhm.
I don't buy the idea. No, it's not about it. There's some of this demand creating supply. It's true, but with these drugs, it's really about supply creating demand. And then, like, the circle is very difficult to parse out because then demand creates more supply, of course. It's just the drug really is creating the demand. Very, and we saw that first with Purdue Pharma and the legitimate opioids back in the 90s, early 2000s, and so on.
I mean, it is also this revolution from plant-based
And that's
drug
why. And that's why. See, this is the thing. If you can make supplies that are so vast, you
and
can
pure.
then it will begin to create its own demand. And that's what does not happen with plant-based drugs, because you have seasons and you just can't grow enough of it really to have that effect, right? And but with synthetics, you can make them every week,
Mhm,
so long as you have the ingredients, and the ingredients come from China, and the ingredients are through the ports, mostly in Manzanillo and Lázaro Cárdenas and Michoacan, and through the Mexico City airport, and various places like that. There is really almost no place in America that does not have these two drugs, which changes history.
mhm,
For a long time, drug historians would tell you that we do these cycles:
mhm,
stimulants to then depressants, back to stimulant, and every 10, 12, 15 years, whatever, there's a new change. Now all that's been wiped clean. There's no more history. It's fentanyl, methamphetamine, made by roughly the same people, smuggled by roughly the same people, sold by roughly the same people, and used by roughly the same people, and killing
mhm,
the same people on the streets. Yes, all of this is synthetic drugs allow for that ghastly supply, and I don't really use adjectives or adverbs. Well, certainly in this case, adjectives very liberally.
mhm.
But when you see the fentanyl fold, I don't know if you've ever seen people bent over almost like they're kissing their shoestrings, you
Mhm,
know,
mhm.
bent over like this, or an inverted L like that, because of that's what fentanyl does. Unlike heroin keeps you kind of like a guy said, kind of like Frankenstein, hunched over just a little bit. Fentanyl bends you all the way over. The it's such an amazing image of subservience
Mhm.
to the drug, to watch someone in a condition, in a position that you or I could not hold for 20 seconds,
Right.
for hours. And you see this. Skid Row, LA is a good place to see that, sadly. Tenderloin, San Francisco, various other places you can see that. And it's all because of this massive supply, unrelenting supply. And that's creating demand. People die. There's more people coming in that are getting hooked because fentanyl is mixed into methamphetamine, or meth into fentanyl, or whatever, or it's in cocaine, or it's dusted into marijuana. So fentanyl is creating demand all the time, just simply by the virtue of its enormous, enormous supply. I get emails, no, don't you understand this about demand? I'm like, no, I understand that you don't know what you're talking about. You need to study these
Yeah,
drugs,
yeah.
not
Specific.
marijuana from, like,
Right,
the 1970s.
right. Right, which, I mean, you just, mentioned, Skid Row, but, and other places like it around the country where, I think the public policies to address this have failed, basically. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's been a miserable, miserable approach. Harm reduction has been a failure because the way it's practiced. Now, there's a lot of ways of reducing harm, but they don't happen to be the ways that people are actually using, the methods people are actually employing, which is going up to people on the street and asking them, do you want treatment? No, I'm fine. Okay. This is a woman who's been raped probably 4 or 5 times in the last month, overdosed on fentanyl, and has brain damage because of her overdose, because overdosing to an opioid reduces the amount of oxygen in the brain. Even though it's temporary, it may be 2, 3, 5 minutes. Would you want a reduction in brain oxygen for 5 minutes? She may be alive, but she's slow. She's in a world where she's viciously addicted to this drug now, not like heroin anymore. It's fentanyl, and the withdrawals are terrifying. And then if you add xylazine or something to it, it makes it even worse, you know? And so she's saying, I'm fine. Well, of course, she's not fine. She's going to be dead tomorrow, or she's going to live another 3 months and she's going to be raped several more times. She's incapable of caring for herself. She's got feces crawling down her leg, all this stuff. And she's living in frequently lethal temperatures. And the reaction is she's not ready for treatment. That is just, I don't know whether to laugh or cry
Yeah.
when I
Yeah.
hear people talk like that. Here's the fact of the matter on the street, Kathleen, and that is you will never in that condition that you see people frequently in, and meth, of course, driving people in mental illness that is just scary to watch. And you see this in all the 10 encampments. In LA, you've got them, all over. You will never be ready for treatment
Hmm.
in the time that it takes for methamphetamine to on the street in the quantities and potency that it's there, for methamphetamine to drive you mad and for fentanyl to kill you. You will not have that time. And so we do not see people living like they did on heroin. I've known many people on heroin live 20, 30 years, not great lives,
Hmm.
but, you know, fine. They're alive, but that is not happening with fentanyl. People
Hmm.
do not survive on fentanyl. Again, this is all about supply. Now, lately, overdoses have dropped. And I think that's largely because the supplies of fentanyl have dropped.
Okay. Well, seizures have dropped. I mean, in the last year at least, they dropped pretty significantly.
I would say since late 23, you can see that dropping, but you can also the overdoses beginning to drop. But you can also see very clearly that the supplies that the DEA tests, for the fentanyl supplies are clearly on the declining, and so you get less of it. That means is that methamphetamine now becomes a bigger part of the
Is it
story,
meth is still
driving
being
people out
used?
of their minds
Yeah.
and making people homeless, or if they're already homeless, keeping them in a state of absolute psychosis and schizophrenia and unable to actually seek treatment or want treatment or express any desire whatsoever about the question, while they're on the street.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so
So,
anyway, harm reduction
yeah.
to me seems to be using methods that were devised in a time long before fentanyl, long
Hmm.
before methamphetamine, in the supplies, and then again, always this in the supplies and the potency, the relentless supplies and the potency that we have seen this nationwide. It just don't. This was these ideas came about during the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and they worked very well. Needle exchange, needle exchange, one for one. You give a needle, because what we're really interested in is getting dirty needles off the street. That's
Hmm.
not happening either. It's no longer in some areas anyway. I don't know. I'm not speaking for the entire country, but I have seen clearly that there's no needle exchange. It's a needle giveaway. And so housing first. The idea that what we need to do is take people who are living in encampments out of their minds
Hmm.
and put them in an apartment. And then, okay, then we'll deal with everything else. Yeah, that doesn't happen. Those people are not capable. What does need to happen is getting them off the street into some place they can't leave. And then over a period of years, I think it does take years with this stuff now. It's no longer like 28 days. That's a laughable amount of time. That's not even 90 days is not close to enough. And then you get transitional housing, stages of housing towards an eventual independence of housing. Yes, but that's not what's happening in many places. I've done an interview with a woman who was a landlord in Los Angeles, and on my newsletter, which is the Dreamland newsletter, samquinones.substack.com, if people want to go there. And she tells about how she kind of got caught up in this housing first idea. She didn't really fully understand it, rented it to a woman who then relapsed and began using drugs again very quickly and destroyed the house.
Hmm.
Anyway, it's like these ideas that worked once
Hmm.
were not adjusted for the new reality presented by fentanyl and methamphetamine in this staggering quantities and staggering potency.
So, if we look at this from the Mexican side of the border, well, as you mentioned, there's been during AMLO's term kind of this denial that fentanyl was being manufactured here at all,
Yes,
and that has kind of fallen by the wayside a bit. But
I guess so.
but as far as addiction in Mexico, it is still relatively low. Now, the official numbers are extremely low as far as overdose deaths from opioids, particularly, and I'm sure it's underreported, but it's not an epidemic like it is in the States, clearly.
I don't think Mexico knows, you
Mm-hmm.
know? There was this great piece in the LA Times a couple years ago about the medical examiner of Mexicali.
Mm-hmm.
And the medical examiner of Mexicali decided for a 12-month period beginning in June of 22, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it's June of 23 to June of 24. I can't remember. Or but it was a 12-month test where everybody that came through
Mm-hmm.
his department for an autopsy, he was going to do a toxicology test. You cannot figure out whether people were on drugs and what drugs they were on unless you do a toxicology. That's a blood test and fluid test. And it's generally, any reporter in the States knows that and this is like, boilerplate with any death investigation, toxicology tests take 6 to 8 weeks to complete. 6 to 8 weeks, fine. Okay. And that's why you hear somebody, a big celebrity dying, and then 6 to 8 weeks later, there's oh yeah, and he had fentanyl, or he didn't, or he had something else, whatever it was. And so this guy, bless his heart, according to the paper, began to test all these bodies that went through his for the one full year. And 20, I don't have it in front of me. Uh, I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, but my understanding was like 24%. 24% of all the bodies coming through the medical examiner's office in Mexicali, Baja California Norte, had fentanyl in them.
Okay.
And that means that's a staggering amount. That's a huge, huge amount. And that's only one town. Now, of course, it's a border town and you're
Yes,
going to
I was
see a
gonna
lot
say
of it.
it's a lot
There's
more.
no doubt about that. But it just highlights the idea that Mexico has no idea
Mm-hmm.
how many people are addicted to fentanyl and or methamphetamine and or cocaine, because there is no real serious treatment. There's some, it's frequently nonprofit or what have you, it's frequently private, but also there's just no serious governmental attempt to test for how many people just might die from this stuff. I thought that was an amazing story. It certainly has grown immensely since I was in Mexico. And the more the supply stayed, the more the fentanyl came or was made in Mexico, rather. And the more the methamphetamine was made in Mexico, some percentage of that stayed in the places where it was made, or in different parts of the country, and began to create again, supply creating demand, a domestic market that did not exist before those supplies remained
Mm-hmm.
in the country instead of going north of the United States.
Right, which is in some ways it's interesting because in Dreamland, I was just thinking about how you describe that these kids basically from Nayarit who were selling this heroin in the States, they weren't using.
No, they weren't. They were lucky to not have the ability
Right,
to
right.
use, because their supervisors were, watching them like a hawk. And also, I have to say this, they were exposed to the worst of American addiction every time an addict crawled into their car.
Sure.
And these were people who were trembling and their arms were scarred and they're hollowed eyed. And these were farm boys. These are guys who are avocado pickers, sugarcane farmers, butchers, you know, and they were like, I think a lot of them were like, I don't ever touch that crap. Now they would use cocaine when they went back home, but and that's another thing.
In both of your books about this, you do talk about some of the factors that you argue could also be part of why addiction to opioids expanded in the way that it did in the States, aside from, of course, what the pharmaceutical industry did, but some societal factors as well that maybe
Yeah.
made it particularly likely to happen. And I wonder if you see anything about the contrast between Mexico and the US here. Again, this is something that, AMLO has been made fun of to some extent, saying that, well, basically Mexican community is better and that the social fabric is better.
Well, I don't think that's wrong necessarily. I would not overemphasize it too much.
Hmm.
I don't think that Mexicans are immune from the situations that are taking over the country in other parts in other ways, and or the world rather in other ways. And I would say yes, we're more of an individual based society, and one more self reliance is more important. And the idea that you would always remain close to your family is obviously not as
Hmm.
important as it is in other countries. All of this, and in at some point, as I think I wrote about in The Least of Us, what was about self reliance, which was a very healthy
Hmm.
impulse in American culture, became isolation,
Hmm.
and then it becomes toxic, and then it becomes a reason for the problems that you're facing, not a bulwark against them, which is what self reliance is,
Hmm.
and then on top of that, you know, since the end of the Cold War, I've thought a lot about this, and the Soviet Union, the Russians learned the wrong lesson about global influence and power, and they thought, well, that the way you develop that is through military might, and they had a system that was absolutely corrupt and inhuman, and it fell apart on its own. By the same token, we have come to certain assumptions about capitalism that are, I think, this is my personal opinion, extraordinarily exaggerated. We won. We beat communism. So therefore, capitalism in its entirety must be fine and just let it go. And that's what we have done since
Or
the
inevitable.
80s, I would say, since the Reagan administration, and certainly in in this century. Just like there's no way of, there's part of the opioid epidemic was we're afraid to stand in the way of people who are making money, even though that they were selling stuff that they had no business selling. You can see that with marijuana today. The marijuana industry is a repetition now of the opioid epidemic, of the opioid problem, the origins of that, which was to say that we're going to allow companies to make and sell legal, hyper potent drugs with outlandish, unproven claims about its risk free nature, because they're making money, and that capitalism's good, and so why stand in the way, Plus, now we're giving them lots of power through the money that we're giving them, and now they're going to be able to influence legislation. So we mistook our victory over communism to mean that capitalism must therefore be allowed wide and almost just basically almost free reign.
Hmm.
And I think that that is what has led us to, not new, but certainly much bigger than ever before, legal addictive economy.
Hmm.
And you can point to many, many things, but starting with smartphone apps and their absolutely devious
Hmm.
algorithms. That's number one. But and overlaying all this, this is overlaid on a culture of not so much self reliance is still part of American culture, but certainly isolation is too,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And so you got isolation and all this other stuff, and then on top of that, you've got ultra processed everything. Okay,
Hmm.
ultra. Let's start with food,
Hmm.
sodas, all the crud that are just highly addictive stuff that people are like, okay, let's make it. You can do it. You can, even though it's toxic, should never. Some of the stuff should never be allowed to be made, or should be highly taxed, so that it really is not something you would use every day. And then moving on to, social media apps that are highly toxic, highly understanding. These corporations understand the neuroscience of our brains very, very, very well. And they understand we have potentially addictive products. Let's make them more so.
Hmm.
So gambling apps in America are the new horrifying scourge. Just terrible, terrible things. There's no reason why they should be allowed to be advertised on the TV in the United States. Tobacco's not advertised.
Right.
Why with gambling apps? Because they're just as toxic and awful. And you see now pornography,
Hmm.
video games. All of this has been accompanied by an understanding that if we make supply easy,
Hmm.
basically, it's supply creating demand. If we make supply easy to access with almost no friction to use, it's the
Hmm.
kind of the term in the retail industry, then we will we will make huge amounts of money, and there's no better customer than one who is addicted to our product. The difference is this is legal stuff now, available on every street corner, and that kind of thing. And it's all been ultra processed. So you see marijuana being ultra processed into these ridiculously potent vapes and consumables and whatnot. Pornography, available like just in scandalous quantities. There's just no way that should be available to young men, especially they're just being deformed before our very eyes. And the gambling apps again, how did they ultra process gambling? Well, it used to be you would bet on a game, who
Right.
won the game. Now I was watching a gambling app again before a football game last night, and now you bet they divide the football game up into, that could be almost an infinite number, not an infinite, but very many, many, many ways of betting. So will this receiver catch 3 balls in the first quarter? And will this receiver score a touchdown in the game? And so divide it up like this, and all of a sudden you have ultra processed gambling the same way you've ultra processed food, which is to say you give people the ability to get blasted by this stuff,
Hmm.
and their brains blasted by this stuff. And now you don't have to be around people to gamble anymore. You could do it from the sad darkness of your own bedroom, all alone. And that's exactly what we didn't learn from the end of the Cold War.
Hmm.
We just said, oh, capitalism must be fabulous. And so all of this, in my view, hell, man, the Sinaloa drug cartel, they're way out here.
Right.
We're
Right.
talking about FanDuel and Pornhub and, of course, TikTok and all the other, things with algorithms that are just so cynically programmed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember in one of the books you mentioned, or maybe both, but that it's the public sector that has to pick up the pieces after this.
Counties. It's mostly counties.
Yeah.
They have the general hospital, the jail, the courts, the
Yep.
foster children. They have the corner. They have the libraries where you're going to many of the libraries anyway, where you're going to see people hanging out in the bathrooms and shooting up in the villa in the bushes. And they have child protective services, which is so the county in America is being crushed
Yeah.
by a lot of this stuff, and the legal stuff is just kind of precursor to the illegal stuff, or maybe that's where people stay. They don't move on to the illegal stuff because they have such access to this
Hmm.
stuff. But it's all the same. It's all about supply being transformed
Hmm.
into a massively accessible, easily accessible, addictive thing, product, stuff, or service, what have you. But it's all about transformation of supply to create demand.
Yeah. So, what is something about that issue broadly that you wish was more part of the conversation, both on both sides of the border about all of this?
Oh, well, definitely here, the guns. My God, come on. This is I don't believe it is in any way a coincidence that the major cartel wars, before the government had to get involved, I think the government had to get involved. There's no way they could allow what was going on in 2005 and early '06. But I don't think it's any coincidence that all that starts in 2005,
Hmm.
which is a year after we allowed to lapse our ban on assault weapons in 2004. And of course, once we allowed that ban to lapse, then all of a sudden more and more, boom, 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 boom. And then for the next several years, it just escalated, and that escalated the violence down in Mexico. Had we not done that, could they have gotten their weapons elsewhere from the Mexican military? Yeah, probably, but not, I don't believe, in anywhere near the quantities that they were able. Could they have gotten it internationally? They probably did, but nothing like what you're talking about. And from the United States, the guns come in, a la hormiga, right? Like little bits, but constant little bits. 5 guns here, 10 guns there, 50 boxes of ammo right over here. And on our side, I believe we have not talked. I try to talk about it every time I give a speech. I think this is an outrage, and we are arming the very people who are killing Americans. It's almost like might as well be sending guns to ISIS.
Hmm.
And of course, it doesn't seem to do much good. But I want to be congruent, as they say in Spanish, and talk about what the United States really needs to do. I think I have to say the jobs of counties and the jobs of treatment providers and the jobs of paramedics and emergency rooms would be much easier to manage if the supplies of fentanyl and methamphetamine were dramatically curtailed. I mean, I was just talking with a ER doc in Las Vegas, where they have a horrifying methamphetamine problem, and he's constantly being attacked and spit at, and people flailing, and they're thinking he's a Martian and stuff like this. Well, this is a direct result of so much methamphetamine that's so potent it's not being cut because there's no need to. That's the thing. It's so potent. It's coming right from the lab wherever it's made, across the border to the brain of the user without ever being cut with anything that might soften, to some degree anyway, the effect on you on the user. So and in Mexico, I just think that I mean the corruption, the lack of willingness or ability, certainly the willingness during the AMLO administration to share information was outrageous. They just had none, and they should have. This has been a damaging thing for the Mexican people for well, since '05, you know, and it's gotten worse and worse every year, or gotten bad, and so this has gone on too long. There needs to be dramatic collaboration, cooperation regarding drug traffickers and drug cartel operations, and especially with regard to deep scrutiny into the chemicals coming in from Mexico, from China to Mexico. And people say, well, this is essential in the problem that both countries face,
Hmm.
is that it's Mexico and there's no scrutiny. Well, wouldn't they then make their drugs in Nicaragua? Yeah, yeah, probably. Then you deal with that then. But the fact that they're in Sinaloa or Nayarit
Hmm.
or Jalisco or Guanajuato or wherever in Mexico means that they are like a less than a day's journey to the United States, probably maybe a couple hours if they're in plane. And that is the thing, that there's this immensely sophisticated population trafficker culture in these areas, all across in different areas across Mexico, and they really are operating with virtual impunity. And if they had cut down on the precursors coming into Mexico, or be able to not cut down on them, but more closely scrutinize to make sure this stuff is going here for this reason. It takes a lot of money, but it's far less than what we're currently paying in slaughter and theft and corruption of institutions and all the rest.
I am always amazed at how well you humanize this story, because I do think that
Thank you.
unfortunately there are a lot of stereotypes that circulate, of course, about both sides and about the traffickers and about the addicts. And yeah,
Yeah.
I think work does a really good job of telling their stories as human beings.
Well,
So
thank you.
yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for taking this time to have this conversation.
It's my pleasure, Kathleen. It's been great talking with you. Thanks so much for asking me.
Thank you. And I will link to your Substack newsletter in the show notes and to your site so people can check out your work. And if you want to stay on top of the national conversation in Mexico, do subscribe to the Mex Patriot. And I'll see you next time.
Okay,
Thank you.
adios. See ya.